Hello and welcome to a recurring segment that I'm going to be calling Found in the Wild. Now, I have a friend named Stan Nachev and he runs a really cool Instagram account. Stan is constantly prowling the city looking for old cars and old buildings, and he finds a lot of really cool stuff. So I thought I would collaborate with Stan and go through some of his photos and talk about some of the cool cars he finds on his travels. Now, the first car Stan brought to me is this. He was biking in Etobicoke, which is a city near Toronto, and found this at the bottom of a ravine. I showed this photo to my girlfriend. She said, that's not even a car anymore, that's just junk. And what could we possibly learn and know about something that is so rusted and so trashed? Well, I was trying to ID this car and I eventually saw the steel wheel, and I recognized that steel wheel, which I recognized immediately as the stock steel wheel from a Chevrolet Vega. I know exactly what that car is. Now, the Chevrolet Vega is a super interesting thing in that it was only Chevrolet's second ever compact car. The first was, of course, the Corvair, which was rear engine, liked to flip over. Ralph Nader hated it. We've done a separate video on the Corvair on this channel already. Now, for GM's second time at bat, they were going against the Volkswagen Beetle, which is ironically the same car they were trying to fight when they built the Corvair. And the Vega is one of those cars that just kind of half brilliance, half laziness, which is classic GM. For example, this was the brainchild of Ed Cole, and he wanted to have an all-aluminum engine. And he almost got his way. Every single Vega did come with an aluminum block, which was actually a huge accomplishment for the time. I don't think any contemporaries in the segment had an aluminum block. That was very racy stuff. But GM being GM, they wanted to cut costs. And how they did that was to give it an iron head, which is absolutely backwards of what most people do, because the aluminum block is really the expensive part of the program here. So the Vega was one of very few engines that was actually top heavy. The head weighed more than the block. The engine itself is a 2.3 liter 4-cylinder, and when it was first made before the smog era and such, it made 90 horsepower in base trim. Now, the Vega engine also suffered from being undersquare, meaning that the bore of the cylinder was smaller than the stroke of the cylinder, which is how they build tractor motors for lots of torque. And it does make lots of torque considering the size of the engine, but it does so at the expense of smoothness. These things thrash around, they're not revvy engines, they're done by 5,000 RPM. Now, the Vega did have some great things going for it. It was also the best handling car in the segment compared to a Pinto or a Beetle. These things handled really, really well. They also happen to look like little miniature Camaros, so I mean, they look pretty great. But they had some major problems. Of course, because you have the iron head and the aluminum block, it means they expand and contract at different rates, meaning that if you overheat one of these engines, you're in bad shape. Now, these engines are very easy to overheat because the radiator is 1 square foot. That's right, 1 foot by 1 foot is the size of a stock Vega radiator. They are that tiny, and they had no overflow tank, meaning as the engine got hot, it just puked its coolant straight on the ground, and that precious coolant that you needed to cool that engine went away every time you drove the car. So this, of course, meant that they were constantly overheating, they were constantly blowing head gaskets, and they were constantly in need of repairs, and that didn't help the Vega's reputation. And also, there were a whole bunch of labor disputes that started taking place for the Vega factory in around '74, and workers kind of just stopped caring. And the reputation of the Vega went absolutely down the tubes. It became known as a car that overheats, that rusted out quickly, and was built by people that didn't care, and they were kind of right. But now let's talk about this exact Vega. So, we know it's a 2-door hatchback, we know it's a Vega, let's talk about the year. So, there's no more trim or bumpers left in this car, but if we look at the front of the car, we can see the mounts where the impact bumpers used to be. That tells us this car was made at least in 1974, because before 1974, we wouldn't have had those big impact bumper mounts. They would have just been mounted to the bodywork. We also know this car cannot be a 1976 or newer because of the location of the oil fill cap on the Vega engine. See how it's located up there at the front of the engine? That is the early engine. There were actually 2 different Vega engines that got offered throughout the line. So I feel pretty confident in saying this is the 1974 or 1975 or maybe a 75 and a half Chevrolet Vega. Now, another interesting thing we can find is from the overhead shot of the engine, we see that it has a 2-barrel intake manifold, which means that this car had the optional L11 2.3 liter 4-cylinder, likely as part of the Chevrolet Vega GT package, which meant this was a sporty car. Now, that meant that in 1974, that engine made 85 horsepower compared to the base engine's 75 horsepower. It did this by better carburation and I think they had a sportier camshaft in them. I'm not entirely sure. One mystery I have for this car is the transmission. This car is so wrecked and so destroyed and so full of leaves that I can't actually see if there's an automatic or a manual backing this thing. I would suspect a manual because it is a GT, but we don't really know. I can't see a shifter, a bell housing, or even a clutch pedal. That will remain a mystery. But one thing I do want to point out in the interior is the interior plastics. Take a look at that. Look how inside the interior kind of, whatever you call that, not a door panel, but just the interior panel, is still in pretty good shape. Vegas were famous for having plastics that would turn different colors in the sun, but also lasted forever. They're made of some horrible Gila monster hide that just never ever dies. You can dunk these things in the ocean and bring them back out. Those door panels are still there. Of course, they're chalky, hard plastic and everything, but they do survive the apocalypse. And this one, actually, that's probably one of the few parts you can pull off this car and actually use. So there you have it. There's actually quite a bit we can learn from this totally burned up, used up car at the bottom of a ravine. We're able to find out that it was a sporty GT model and able to talk about the cool engine that made the Vega so famous and infamous. Anyways, we'll be bringing this segment back every time Stan finds us a cool car to look at, and I'm really excited to see what he's going to find next.